Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your last day of ASU+GSV. My name is Annie Hale. I'm the Executive Director of the Action Lab at Arizona State University's EdPlus. I run a think tank and internal learning laboratory that studies various assets that Arizona State makes investments in. And I'm particularly interested in game-based assessments, and I'm here accompanied by some of my most esteemed colleagues. We're going to be discussing today leveling up assessments, the game-changing power of play in education. We have a series of questions that we're going to be discussing with the panelists. If you have questions, you can either save them to the very end or join people outside in the hallway afterwards for a quick dialogue. But let's jump in. Let's get started. We've got some seats in the front. If anybody wants to be brave to come on up, feel free to do so. We're going to go ahead and ask each panelist to introduce themselves. Tell us a little bit about who you are, why you're interested in game-based assessments.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Sarah Brenzel. I'm a product manager at Roblox. And I've worked on two game-based assessment products, one being a hiring cognitive game-based assessment that seeks to evaluate, how skilled are applicants at specific skills that are required to succeed in an entry-level position. And then I also work on the education team, and as you all probably know, assessment is essential for achieving and measuring educational outcomes. So we advise our educational content developers who build curriculum on the Roblox platform on the most effective methods for assessing their students through our platform.
Hi, my name is David Weiss. I was a former math teacher for 11 years in Bangkok, London, New York, and in Vancouver. And then I became a curriculum designer and instructional coach for New Visions for Public Schools. And then most recently I've been working with Dreambox Math, and now I'm working with DE because Discovery Education purchased Dreambox. So it's been great. I have used games to assess mathematics, but also to drive curiosity and engagement in my teaching. And I've been doing that in my curriculum design, and of course doing that with my coaching and teaching teachers how to use games in their own teaching. And so I'm really interested in this link between using assessment in games, but also linking it to the learning and to the engagement for students.
Hi everyone, Tyler Matta. I'm the Vice President of Learning Science Engineering at HMH. I've spent most of my career in the assessment world, but I was actually an art teacher in New York City before I did my PhD in computational statistics, and now kind of run this group. I was not much of an assessment person as a student, and so most of my career now is trying to make them less painful for those who have to engage with them. And so we are a team that works on both adaptive learning and adaptive assessments, trying to bring out a richer set of values into how we build these products that teachers rely on and school leaders rely on and kids have to engage in. And we're always just trying to push the bounds of like what we can do and what we can build out reliably and validly to say what kids know and bring to the table.
Yeah, so pushing those boundaries is really interesting. As a researcher, I'm curious about how do games and tests make students feel about learning, and how can we make sure that the fun part is there, but that we don't distract from the actual studying aspect of the assessment? David, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, okay. So when you think about games have rules, they have engagement, they have I'm forgetting, but the games are things that are fun, right? So we have to keep that aspect in our learning with students. And I think we want to drive learning with curiosity and engagement. So I'm going to pass just for a sec. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go to Sarah.
Lost my train of thought.
Don't worry.
Yeah, no, just to build on that, with the Roblox education product and thinking about, how we can make screen time valuable for our learners. We think about meeting them where they're at, where they're already engaged, because it's clear that when they're engaged, that's when they retain the most and they learn the most. They kind of get into the flow state where time is flying by quickly and they're just kind of stopping up and continuing to throw themselves at whatever problem set they're dealing with. And so I think that's, at least at Roblox and probably in a lot of game-based assessments or products, That's what we're trying to leverage, how much they love to spend their time with the product, and again, increase the positivity of their screen time.
Tyler or David, tell us, really here, like, does the fun part distract from the studying part? How do we get at that?
I have a good example, if you don't mind. I want to quit myself here. So I used to teach kids how to graph things, right? And so you'd sort of say, oh, you want to move over by the x-axis and move up by the y, et cetera. And what I learned very quickly is that that is a boring experience for children, and no child finds that interesting or entertaining, et cetera. So one day I spent an afternoon and I designed a game where you move a little stick man, and at the same time it shows you your progress over time, and it's creating basically a distance time graph. And what happens is it becomes a game because you have a rule. You're allowed to move the stick man. You have an engagement, an interaction, right? When you move the stick man, something else happens on the screen. And what's critical is that you get feedback on your progress, right? So you have a little graph you're trying to match with this game. And so what's fascinating is that students will go over and over and over again to try to get the graph perfect, right? Whereas you ask them to like draw a graph. I don't know if anybody has ever asked a ninth grader to draw a straight line graph. They are done as soon as anything is down on paper. It looks anything like a straight line. So this gamification, it's not just gamification, but we're using the context to drive the learning, and the game and the learning are all, and the assessment are all sort of wound together rather than being separate things.
And I think one thing to keep in mind is we can look at assessments as games, like just before we even bring them into a literal game context. Sometimes they're just not that good in game design, and sometimes they just appeal to a very narrow kind of set of students who are willing to engage in those rules, engage in what's expected of them and those constraints. And so part of that is like when are they kind of stop being fun? I think even when we care about the learning of them, we're not even getting kids to engage. And so whether they're fun or not, it's like we need kids actually attending to want to engage in that. And right now, if we keep the SAT on down to state summative, all the way to exit tickets in the classroom, those can always be viewed in the lens of the game and game design, and sometimes they're just not terribly good. And that's coming from someone that's worked on these for a very long time. And so it's like, how do you actually build that into a richer experience, keeping the values that we care about students knowing and showing in a way that they're willing to engage and kind of put up with those constraints and those challenges.
Okay, yeah, I really appreciate that. Not all games are created equal. So thinking about, what has worked well for matching games with the required curriculum, like there's state standards, there's other things that we're trying to achieve in the, in the instructional sequencing of content. How do we figure out where to plug in games? Where does it make the most sense within the curriculum, or perhaps even in a particular school? Like you gave the example of graphing, but where else could it fit in, and where does it fit in well, or maybe not good at all?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and one we think a lot about at Roblox when we're looking to engage with curriculum developers. What topics or subjects suit the platform the best and suit games the best? Naturally, STEM emerges because there are physics involved in a 3D virtual world, and so both the person who's creating the product and the one who's engaging with it can test, retest, simulate, learn through failure, learn through balancing different elements of the science-based simulation. But also I think language learning is also really coming to the surface as AI is advancing, because there's tools like products like soapboxes, which can analyze what you're saying, turn it into text, give you feedback on how well you spoke. So that's another thing we're thinking about. But it really takes a lot of creativity to think about covering the breadth of curriculum. Some are more natural fits, and others require a little bit more, thinking outside the box.
David?
Well, yeah, I would say that there are places where it's a good fit. So if we're driving curiosity and engagement with this game, and it fits the content we're trying to teach, or assess really well, I think that's a really good fit. I know of games where there's really interesting gameplay, and then you stop the gameplay for a moment, you do a multiple choice question and click the right button, and then you get some points and you get to continue in the game. And I would say that's, to me, like maybe we've assessed something there, but it doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel like the right use case. And I think there are areas where we can be creative and discover interesting ways of assessing and understanding the content, but not everything's going to work, right? So we should give up on the things that are not going to be very easily assessed. And I think also working together more as a community when we discover great ideas about how to design and engineer for particular content, I think would be really helpful for us. Because as we make discoveries, I mean, so the medical community advances because they advance together, right? So if we advance together, maybe we can solve some of the thornier problems in terms of game-based assessment collectively. And then, okay, now we've got a way of using this thing. Let's go off and let's turn this, now we can turn it into a game and it'll make sense for the future.
Tyler, do you want to add anything to that?
Most of where we're standing in and what we've done so far is like on the supplemental side. I do think there's a real opportunity to say like, how do you bring this into like your core experience in the classroom? But right now, everything we've ever touched in games from the various places I've been has always been supplemental. And so it's like leaving it to the teacher's devices to find that right time to bring it in versus like leading with that as kind of how we move into. And I think that's an open question that like, at least I know our group isn't the one to drive that. That's probably more in the school context of how are we designing the day of teaching and learning to bring these in at the right times, at the most opportune times.
You bring up a really good point, which is that we should be designing with schools, right? Like we want to get something that's going to work for schools. Design with teachers, design with students. And I think that will help drive to see if the thing that we thought was going to work does in fact work for students.
Perfect segue into me thinking about learning objectives. So I'm faculty at Arizona State University in the College of Global Futures. And when I create and tinker with my class, I always think about what are those learning objectives and how do I effectively get students there? And then, of course, try to assess along the way to make sure that we're marching towards those learning outcomes. How do we embed this idea of learning outcomes in game-based assessments? Do we need to do that? Or what does that look like to accurately measure educational outcomes?
If you don't mind. So when we design a game or a lesson, we take the big idea that we want to teach and we break it into the smaller pieces, micro objectives that we want to assess. And then we spread out those micro objectives across a number of experiences. And from that, we can generate some adaptivity, right? So if a child gets a portion of a learning thing correct, but not another portion, then we can say, for example, we can see the child knows how to count, but they don't know how to use a number line. So maybe we need more lessons on number line, but the counting can get a bit more rigorous. So we can adapt and sort of take the big picture of the thing we're trying to learn and break it into smaller pieces that fit within an actual 2-minute game. I mean, you think about it, how long do people want to play a game that's not super interesting, right? 2 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe.
Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
This is something I'm particularly passionate about, and that kind of launched me into working in game-based assessment. But if you remember, as we were all going through school, they would ask you to show your thought process, and you could get partial credit for pieces along the way. And I really think that that is the unique power of game-based assessment, is that you literally have a record of what they did, where their mouse went, what they saw. And so as we kind of adapt and evolve our technology for evaluating that kind of partial credit or the telemetry data that they're generating, the more powerful our tools become to evaluate a person's understanding of a subject. I think the challenging part is that there's also these templates that school districts and schools use to kind of form their evaluation of the student. So how do we take this very complex data set and then kind of force that into this rigid framework? I think that's where there's a lot of room for growth.
And I would say, like, going back to learning objectives, so we partnered with Roblox, launched a game back in December on Newton's second law, and a lot of that was kind of using next generation science standards at the core of the narrative arc, right? So we were partnering with, like, how do you create something engaging? Well, what are those values we care about most? And we kept going back to, like, how are we making sure it's not the gameplay that's the constraint that's going to drive kids crazy, but rather, like, using those cognitive processes and making sure as that game arcs through, we're bringing kind of all 3 dimensions of what we care about in those next generation science standards into that game and making sure that those are the pieces that they're able to demonstrate throughout and their success is based on those and not some of like kind of the superficial aspects of gameplay. And just getting it to balance that out was probably our biggest challenge. And it was only until we got that narrative and that engagement kind of articulated that we were able to kind of start making process. So we brought it in at the very early to say, like, this is what it has to be designed to do, not kind of putting it at the end, trying to find it.
How important are like the instructor or teacher dashboards? Because you're talking a lot about making sure that you can see kind of real time what's happening. How much attention is paid to the back end, or what does that look like? Sarah, I don't know if you have any thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we think about a lot because as a platform, we want to provide the tools for developers to be able to have, to be able to show the progress or understanding to the teacher, but we also don't want to constrain them to say, this is how it must work. So kind of back to those rigid frameworks, how do we allow that flexibility? Honestly, we're still really early on in that. We're still figuring it out. I think the important thing is that the teacher has just some indication of where their student is in understanding, whether that be a supplemental assessment, whether that be in the experience itself. It really, for us, depends on the curriculum developer and provider.
Anything you guys want to add?
Well, yeah, so we have dashboards. They show data. And we find that those data are most useful for a district administrator who's trying to figure out, is this program working? How well is it working? They're kind of evaluate the status of the program, or they're trying to figure out which students need more support. So at that level, it's quite helpful. What we, I think, are still working on is providing actionable information for educators that drives their instruction. Mostly where we're saying, oh, the student is struggling with this standard. And honestly, as an educator, I always use my best stuff the first time. So when a student was struggling with something, like, what do? Slow down? Talk louder? So we have to find ways of providing information that isn't just a spreadsheet, basically, in disguise, that actually allows educators to make interesting choices about what they want to do, right? So, for example, we have a feature where you can go and explore what's going on in the lesson. What did the student actually do, right? So it's not just in the number at the end, but the actual actions the kid took, which is kind of a contextual information that's not always provided in some platforms. So to your problem, maybe you need to find ways to surface the kinds of engagement kids are doing, right? So the educators can take action on that information, which I think would be really valuable, rather than being stuck with a list of numbers, which tell them very little about what to do.
Now, just going back to what Sarah was saying on game-based education, you have the telemetry data that kind of tells you everything you're doing. Getting that built out appropriately takes a tremendous amount of effort. So if we care about cognitive process, the only way you can get to that is through behavior. You're spending a lot of time mapping out and making sure what data we're collecting is something we could be using, because oftentimes things go uncollected and then you can't tell that story. So the layers of transformation that go through from students engaging on screen, collecting those, aggregating them, and then sending them back in a meaningful way to teachers is really equally as challenging as I was just talking about, like kind of building that narrative arc with the learning outcome. So it's kind of through the entire end that we're always kind of paying attention to what do we care about students engaging with this at the end, and how do we tell that story for the teacher or other stakeholders that makes sense and is actionable. But yeah, kind of starting from the very start of, are we eventing the right aspects of behavior and making sense of them in a way that we care about?
Fascinating. Okay, I'll admit that I have not thought about districts wanting access to that information, but it makes sense. Maybe I'm just off in my own higher ed moment here. Okay, my next question, I'm going to stay at the meta level, and then my follow-up question will go down to the micro level, okay? So the meta level, thinking about diverse educational backgrounds in general, are there districts, are there pockets that game-based assessments work well for or don't? Like, what are the challenges or what are the affordances in that like more meta ecosystem, not at the individual student level? Any thoughts there at the diverse educational setting?
Yeah, there's I think certainly in the world of education gaming, there's this idea that some people are coming in with experience with games, and then there are others who don't. And navigating that complex UI, where you're being assessed some level of high stakes assessment, then that can be a little bit defeatist to be like, I'm disadvantaged because my fellow student here is a gaming expert and I'm coming in and I don't know how to play. And that also can correlate with socioeconomic status. Did you have access to consoles, to other gaming devices growing up? So I think what we do to try to mediate that is make sure that we level the playing field up front, provide the tools where someone can familiarize themselves with the UI, with the game systems, before they're being assessed. And that's really, over time, especially with the cognitive game-based hiring assessment that we've built for McKinsey and for Roblox, that was so important because that's a bias that's really hard to measure. You could ask in a survey, do you have experience with games? But then how is that going to affect their score or your evaluation of them? So you have to give them the space to become comfortable with it before they're being assessed.
Yeah, that's a great point. David?
Yeah, we found the same thing in ours, right? So we have new students who come and they're new to Dreambox and they're using the program for the first time. They absolutely don't know all of the sort of tacit knowledge that's required to play this game, regardless actually of their gaming background. It's just new to doing math in this way. Having to show their reasoning isn't something that every elementary school student is used to doing. So one of the things we do to mitigate this is we have very minimal high stakes assessment, right? So what we do is we do formative assessment over a long period of time. So that allows us to adapt and to move students as we discover more about them. We start with an advantage of game-based assessment, especially digital assessment, is it actually knows nothing about the student. So it doesn't make any judgments based on their appearance or their social and economic status. It makes judgments based purely on the actions they're taking, which, to your point, a lot of those actions are result of their previous experiences, right? So giving kids a long period of time in order to adapt and understand the thing that they're doing is really, really helpful. And then judging their performance formatively over that long period of time rather than one time period means that at the end of the time period, you've sort of smoothed out and averaged out some of those differences that existed in their understanding before they started playing.
And I just want to bring it back again. I think how we engage with assessments today, especially computer-based assessments, isn't also something most students are coming into schools knowing how to do. And a lot of schools spend a lot of time in that practice. So I think is, again, kind of a value orientation to what are those patterns, those engagements we care about. And right now it's usually kind of gearing up towards that summative assessment, at least in K-12. But kind of to the diversity lens, it's also not just like, here's the game, everyone should like it, but it's knowing at least how we validate a lot of our work is in very specific geographies with very specific populations, not assuming we want to generalize, but knowing different communities are going to care about different aspects, have different values, have different ways of engaging, and kind of taking that as the default versus if we could just average out and have a big generalized population, everything gets smoothed out and we can show it works across the country. And so I think like where we're trying to push is more of like smaller scale, very specific validation studies to say, does it work in these kinds of communities versus, oh, we ran just a massive study, but nothing could be disaggregated with any kind of integrity. And so it may actually not work for many people at all.
So tell me, what happens if you find yourself in a school district or in a community where there's low or no computer skills? I mean, how do we overcome that barrier? What does that look like? Maybe Tyler, if you want to pick up where you kind of left off. I don't know. You're kind of going that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, because again, so much, everything we talk about, at least in my world today, is like one-to-one computer to student ratios. And there's such a drive there. And there's almost more of a point of privilege now to say like, oh, we don't touch technology for so long, right? It's and so it's tricky to kind of balance that out. And I think, again, it kind of just goes to the value orientation. But I would also say if we care about games versus video games, because I think teachers can also be game designers, and we could do things that aren't on a screen. And there's many things, like we play card games, we play active games of play. And so like the way we think of game and engagement and struggle through that game, like it can go beyond just it's on a screen and it's a video game. And I think that's one of the more powerful components of education is like getting that level of engagement no matter what it looks like. And so if technology is not there, there are other avenues to get to play and engagement through game that isn't, I think, what we could now think of as like video game oriented play.
So I want to add on there because I have done this exact thing. We had some dice, we had some coins or tokens, and a piece of paper. And we played a game where we put the numbers from 2 to 12 on the piece of paper, and the kids put 10 tokens down of their choice. They had 2 different colors so they could keep track. And they were trying to figure out where's the best place to put the tokens. And initially kids are like, I'm going to put them on the 2 and the 12 because those are my favorite numbers. Then you roll the 2 dice and add them, and you find out that 2 and 12 are not very common. So it's a learning objective, right? Watching kids change their strategy as they play this game. And like you said, it's every classroom can get pair of dice. I think in some states you have to call them number cubes. Number cubes. and paper and et cetera. You don't need very much to do some very simple games that drive to sort of some really deep ideas about probability that are really necessary in today's world to understand.
Yeah, just to jump in there too, I think another way to accommodate the diversity of students is to say with a hiring assessment, not treat that as the gatekeeper of, say, getting the position or getting into the college, but as a data point, as one data point in a slew of data points that are evaluated and assessed, so that if there is, say, a shortcoming or, say, even like an accessibility difference that can't be accounted for by that assessment, use other means to kind of calibrate and to understand if that is a very specific shortcoming. So like say, like what you're talking about with more tactical games, like that could be one of those data points and help us not just, put everything on this one type of assessment.
David, do you want to add something?
Well, I wanted to add something. You said accessible, and you said accessible. And I think it's really critical that EdTech companies make their products accessible to all users. So we're working on a project right now to make our product, Dreambox Math, and the reading product, accessible to users who don't see things very well. Either they have low vision or they have motor issues, so they're using a keyboard or they're using a screen reader, et cetera. And I think too long we've kind of been ignoring this crowd, and I think it's really critical that if we really mean all learners, we need to have our products work for everybody. So the accessibility doesn't necessarily mean that the technology exists that the kids have in their hand, but also that they can use it.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask a wild card question. What games are you three playing right now?
Hearthstone.
Oh, I have many games. The one I play on my phone most often is called Slay the Spire. Anybody here ever played that?
Yes.
Collectible cards. Yeah, okay, a few people. Most of you have not. If you've not, you should try it, but it's a pretty geeky game.
I probably have the blandest answer. I play Connections on the New York Times app. That's about it.
I love it.
How about you, Annie?
Let's see. Honestly, I love Mario, so I'm a big Super Mario fan. So we play a lot of Super Mario. I have my old school Nintendo system, and I play it with my 7-year-old a lot.
Mario is such a fabulous example of assessment too, right? Like you think about it, the worlds, they start out easy and then they get really hard, and then you make it to the next world. Sorry, the levels are easy and then hard, and you get to the next world and it drops down again, right? So you're sort of cycling up and down, but you're also keep letting the child have access and agency into what they're doing. What have they accomplished? Here's the goals. Here's the things I've managed. So Mario is a fabulous game.
And if they break the controller after, then they might have a rage problem.
Absolutely.
But it's true, though, because I always say to Max, my 7-year-old, like, you have to understand how to fly in this sequence, because if you don't master it here, you won't be able to fly later on, and then you'll not be able to beat Bowser. But let me ask another more tricky question. So in these ecosystems, we're giving up potentially lots of data, not only like about the school districts, the students, the times at which they're playing, the sequence of which they're moving through these game-based assessments. How do we deal with that? We pair it with demographic data because we want to understand and we want to do due diligence, but what does the governance structure look like? Are you guys worried about data privacy? Talk to me about that.
So I know a little bit about this because it's not my total area of expertise. I know that there are laws in place that tell you how you should treat the data, and that we follow those laws. And I think that's really a basic requirement. I think we also do things where we keep things like demographic information separate from the performance data for students, so that if a hack did occur, that a person might get one or they might get the other, but they wouldn't get both necessarily. I think it's also really important to teach the customer, right, how to treat this data. So it's not just about the data that we produce, but also when we display it, the educator needs to know that this isn't something you should be putting up on the wall for everybody to look at. One of our best practices for districts, for example, is they should anonymize their student names. Kids pick a nickname, or the teacher picks a nickname for the student, so that worst case scenario, something bad did happen, which as far as I know, nothing has. If something did happen, it wouldn't be immediately connectable to those students. It'd be something that it would have to take some work to figure out.
And I'll just kind of follow up on that. So we do a lot of work on the research side to show empirically, like, games lack bias, or when they do, we can identify them, which means we do have to actually couple personal information with performance data. And when we do that, it is in a very small secure space. And so we struggle actually because we are a group that kind of prizes the notion of open science. Things should be transparent. It shouldn't be a private company who has total control in a black box, and what we tell you is certainly correct. Everyone's fallible. But at the same time, we partner with districts and schools and build that trust that gives us the information we don't have in our system. So a lot of things that we need to use to show that this is biased or not comes from those districts, not from our systems. And so building that trust with them is kind of the counterpoint. And so we do everything from keeping those environments exceptionally secure. Only very few people doing that work have access. And we also have very specific and automated data destruction policies that say when this is done and the analysis is over, we get rid of that data. And we have an audit that shows now it's destroyed. And it's not something that we can just like hoard this because it's fun to analyze. But so we try to keep that, stewards of that data that the districts are trusting us with. And so it's hard because we want to show to the public we have integrity, we're being transparent, but sometimes you can't be transparent in the name of open science that we'd want to be because of that relationship.
Yeah, and when we were kicking off the Roblox education product, we did a number of interviews with school district technology administrators to say, like, what requirements must we meet in order to be used in your school district, potentially in the future? And we learned, around data privacy that, obviously PII is very sensitive, but that specifically it shouldn't be used for non-educational purposes. And that is so, interpretable in a million different ways. Like, what does it mean to use that data in non-educational purpose? What about improving the product? If we use their data, their location, their demographic to improve the product, is that considered an educational purpose? So often we look to, court cases to understand what the precedent is. Like, where do companies get pushback? What feels right? What doesn't feel right? But ultimately, it's such an important thing to get right, but is not defined very clearly at the same time.
That makes sense. Okay, so my last question, and then there might be room for one or two questions from the audience, so be prepared, is what about AI? How is this shaking up the landscape? I have to ask it because here we are. It's been a big topic every session I've been in. Well, what do we think here? AI, game-based assessments, what's the future look like? Sarah.
Yeah. So, I'm not a learning scientist, so I'm kind of speaking off the cuff here. But I think also from this conference and just from working with some learning scientists, data scientists, psychometricians, that the educator presence and someone taking that kind of subjective view to understand where you're at and where your gaps are and to support you is so important. So that's where I see the opportunity for AI, some type of assist that's like looking at your data, giving you real-time feedback based on that and pointing you in the right direction so that if you're deficient in some areas, it can take that kind of, step back view.
Well, and so we think about AI in games, right? And anybody ever played a game that had bad AI, right? You're playing the game and you're super easy to beat the AI, or it is calculating 20 moves in advance and it's impossible to win, right? So getting the AI in the game design, I think, is also really interesting. So thinking about how the AI can leverage what's happening from the learner and then make choices. So you were talking about your 7-year-old needing a particular move to be successful later, right? So imagine if Super Mario was measuring whether or not they use that move, right? And they can then say, okay, well, you need to use this move. So we're going to put coins in a different pattern on this next world than we originally planned because we recognize that you need this move to be successful in the future. So we're going to adapt the gameplay to your needs. And I think that's something that I could not do as a designer, right? The number of iterations it would have to account for every possible version of student understanding is too large. But maybe this is something artificial intelligence could solve.
Yeah, and I would just go back to like fit for purpose and the design layer. So it's like, let's not just bring in AI because we can say now it has AI, but like find that piece in the design that it's best suited for. So if we're thinking prompting, if we're thinking any kind of like support through the game, like let that be the reason to do it, not just because you want to put a badge on it that says like this now has AI and so we should like it more. So at the design layer, like let it solve the problem. Don't just try to find the problem that it can solve.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, guys. Are there any questions from the audience? If anybody wants to be brave and ask a question right now out loud to the group. Yes?
Go back to how do you level up game-based assessments?
Yeah, how do we level up game-based assessments?
What is your baseline?
What is our baseline? To take them from where they are to where they want to go. Yeah.
In my mind, there's this when you're assessing someone, you have kind of a top-down expectation, right? You say if they do this, then this, or if they do this, then this. But I think it's all, like leveling up to me means taking that bottoms-up perspective, not just knowing what to look for, but also using the data that they generate to tell you something. So say if you run a correlation study and say, people with this telemetry or data pattern are excellent at this, be aware of that and don't just try to fit them into your expectations.
Well, I think also we can use the data that we generate to iterate and improve the work that we're doing, right? So we have a game, we try it out, we see how it works with students, we go and sit with them and see what happens when they play it. That's a kind of data, very useful. And then we collect that and analyze it and say, okay, well, we need to adjust what we're doing. So over time, we're trying to iterate and improve on a product without the assumption that it's like one and done. Oh, we released it, good, now product cycle, move on to next thing. No, we need to go back and make sure the thing that we released is in fact working for educators and for students.
So back-end data, observing the student, and maybe talking to them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Tyler?
I'm going to go back to the design side and what I said, I think first, which is I think we should look at all assessments through the lens of games, and they fit that really well. And let's try to up-level a lot of the assessments. Let's get students wanting to engage, wanting to struggle, wanting to live into the constraints that are on every single assessment they're seeing throughout the day. And I think there's a lot of aspects, good aspects out of games, not just surface level kind of gamification that is the extrinsic motivator, but actually wants kids to be engaging and not just kind of keep it as we've been doing for the last 50 plus years. So I think there's like a way to level up everything that games aren't touching right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We will take your question out in the hall. I just want to thank our panelists here for this really engaging conversation. You got me thinking about lots of things. I want the coin aspect in Mario from Max. Thank you very much.